I want you to know I ordered up especially the weather for today because you can't talk about Frankenstein without having gloom and doom. So it was a dark and stormy day. This is not a lecture and it's not going to be distinguished by any means. I hope it has some fun to it. But I did want to find out who my audience is, and I noticed some of you are way far back, like things haven't changed since I retired. So I'm not an expert on Mary Shelley, and I'm not a lecturer. Generally, when I taught my classes, it was a kind of conversational approach. But I am a good example of a lifelong learner, and I know that term sometimes gets overused. But when Jenny called and asked me to do it, I thought to myself, I don't know anything about Mary Shelley. I haven't even read Frankenstein. And then I thought, oh, great, here's something new I can learn about. And since I graduated from Yavapai College and became part of the Ollie community, I have found that I love doing research, but I'm not very self-disciplined. And so the only way I can channel my research is either by creating classes that I can teach through Ollie or by doing research for things like this. And so, of course, what happened is I started doing the research. I went down many rabbit holes and learned a whole bunch of things, some of which I'm just going to share with you today because I bet there are people here that know a lot more about Frankenstein and Mary Shelley than I do. And I also, I don't want to hash over things that you can find out on your own because there's a lot written about her. This is in your library. I got it really cheap, you know, at a used bookstore. So anyway, I want to share something with you. How many of you are students? Okay. How many of you are Ollie people? You can raise your hand too. Okay, so those of you who are students, I was part of the group that started the work on the original Gen Ed program and the Technology and Human Values class. Are any of you from that class? Oh, good. I'm going to call on you a whole bunch. You want to sit up here? No. Anyway, I'm starting out in a little bit different way because I have to tell you, I'm a Yavapai College groupie. I started here as an adjunct in 1983. My son called it Apple Pie College. And I started out as an adjunct when I was pregnant with that son, and then I became a full-time faculty. And then when I retired, I just was the easiest thing to go over and work with Ollie, especially since I didn't have to grade papers anymore. And that's a nod to Laura, who's in the English department. Anyway, I'm going to read you part of the Gen Ed values statement of Yavapai College because I think it's really relevant to what we're going to be talking about today. And this is from the values of general education. Yavapai College's general education program is designed to encourage curiosity and an active interest in the world, practical, disciplined thinking, the development of personal and civic values, and a willingness to acknowledge and appreciate diverse cultural and historical perspectives. And that technology and human values class that we were talking about came out of the development of the mission statement and the values that we wanted to have. We wanted people to think multidimensionally and to recognize that ambiguity is part of life and that everything is not black and white. And I think that what we're looking at with Frankenstein and technology and human values and a lot of the cultural and technological issues that are going on right now reflect that need to understand and grapple with the gray areas of our lives. Okay, so I want to find out who you are. First of all, I know kind of who's read Frankenstein? Okay, I'm raising my hand halfway. I didn't finish it, and I don't feel badly about that at all. I'll have it finished by book club on Tuesday. And Susan Gerhardt, who's sitting here, she's my friend and fellow Ollie person who's a computer science person who retired from Embry-Riddle, and she and I are going to be teaching a class together for Ollie on Ada Lovelace and on Mary Shelley, and she finished the book. So I will rely on you to back me up. So what about who's seen the movie? You've seen at least one movie, even if it's Frankenweenie, right? Okay, and a lot of you will recognize that our perceptions about Frankenstein and the monster really come from the 1931 movie. They don't come from the book, and so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on any individual piece of it. But I do want you to know, who knows what the first film of Frankenstein was? The first film. Jenny!
Was it Thomas Edison?
Yes, 1910, Thomas Edison's production company did a 16-minute silent film. And thanks to the good side of YouTube, you can watch it. It's pretty grainy and pretty primitive, but I thought that was interesting that that was the very first one because, in a sense, Thomas Edison was dipping into that Frankenstein pool with a lot of the inventing that was going on at the time period. Oh, I forgot I can... Okay, got ahead of myself here. Anyway, I do want, it's kind of hard to get data on Frankenstein. I wanted to know how many people have read it worldwide, how popular it is. And so I couldn't find a number, but I did find a website that listed every single book of Frankenstein that was published. And those are just a few of the languages that has been published in: Urdu, Serbian, Korean, Spanish, Danish, all those different languages from around the world. And so really Frankenstein is a global phenomenon. And of course when we look at what makes good literature and what makes something universal, clearly there are issues and characters and problems and just the sheer beauty of the language and the captivating themes and plot transcend whatever culture you come from, and I think that's a good example of it. I'm going to start at an odd place. I'm going to start locally. Okay, anybody hear of the Frankenstein Bicentennial project? Okay, you want to tell us what it is?
Well, I mean, it's a national event, actually. It's a national project, so there's universities from all across the country who are participating in different events to celebrate the Bicentennial.
And it started in 2016, and it's actually global. Okay. And the reason I brought it up first is, who would have thought that Arizona State University would be the hub of the 2 years of the project and the focal point for disseminating all the information. They have a fabulous website. I decided not to put a link in because I don't trust technology when I'm giving talks. And I did want to show you that it touches on every aspect of culture. You still have time to participate in some of the events, and one of them is an exhibit at the art museum called Frankenstein at 200, and it's all kinds of art. And I'm going to call on Susan because Susan made the, have you been there? Okay, Susan.
Art museum? No,
but you've been
to one event, a moonscape at the center.
Okay, so what we have is the Center for Science and the Imagination, and Susan was the person who actually told me that they have little videos that they've created that are about 4 or 5 minutes long that touch on different aspects of Frankenstein. And so one will be on the science of Frankenstein, for instance, that notion of galvanizing, that comes from Galvan, where you take electricity and you're supposed to be able to create life, and they were doing all kinds of experiments with frogs, and things like that, that she was aware of, that Shelley would go to these lectures. So it's a very, very rich website that if you're going to do research or if you're just curious about all things Frankenstein, you have about 2 more months to explore the site, and they have events all month that they're putting on. They're continuing to have events. One is a free lecture at the Mesa Center for the Arts, and so if you go into that website first, you'll find everything you need. And I'm just going to read one part of it. That's their mission statement, which is on the website. And it's so compatible with the Gen Ed value statement of Yavapai College that I really liked seeing that. And it says, serves as a network hub for audacious moonshot ideas and a cultural engine for thoughtful optimism. Now, I think that's a really interesting statement. And so I'm trying to figure out what audacious moonshot ideas are. And there are many, many articles that are posted on the website that explore these different issues. So I would encourage you to go there. Okay, so now we go backwards from 2016 when the Bicentennial project occurred to 1816, our first dark and stormy night all summer. Who's familiar with the year of no summer? Nobody. Oh, good. Okay, this is one of those, what we'll call that, you've heard the term butterfly effect. In 1815, I better follow my notes, Mount Tambora, which was on a little island off of Indonesia, it was a volcanic eruption of gigantic proportions. It says it was 100 times bigger than Mount St. Helens, and the conservative death toll from both the direct impact of the volcano and indirect later is 100,000, but that's probably pretty small. And the odd thing about it was the greatest impact was on New England, Canada, and Western Europe. And so, for instance, if you go on to YouTube, you'll find those videos that say 10 things that happened because of Mount Tambora or whatever. And they, for instance, attribute the birth of Mormonism to Mount Tambora because Joseph Smith's family were Vermont farmers, and there was such a devastation, crop failure because of the cold snaps that they moved. And so they moved to New York, and that simple change gave him a different setting and different people to interact with, and then suddenly we have the birth of this other thing. So it's a pretty interesting phenomenon. I'll just read you part of what it said from the many journals from the time period of New England. Early August 1816 was sunny and warm. Farmers planted new crops, hoping the growing season might last beyond the first frost in October. Then there was a cold spell on the 13th and 14th of August, and of course signaling a drop in temperature, 30 degrees within a few hours. Well, I personally know what that is like because I lived in Canada, and they had, Chinook winds would come in, and I remember walking to school in Calgary when I was in middle school in a heavy coat and mittens and a hat, and I'd walk home for lunch and I would be shedding everything along the way because literally that wind would come and raise the temperature 30 degrees. So imagine it going in the opposite direction. It was responsible for famine, crop failures through Ireland, and of course what happens when you have those kinds of economic failures, you get movement, and so people migrate. So a lot of that western migration into the Midwest came as a result of loss of their livelihood of farmers from New England. So it's a pretty fascinating thing to read about, and of course what we're most concerned about is what the heck does that have to do with Mary Shelley? And so the story of the percolation and birth of the Frankenstein book has everything to do with Mount Tambora. So this is one of the most common stories I think everybody knows. Can somebody in a really quick way summarize what happened, how the germination of Frankenstein came about? It was a dark and stormy night where, who, why? Anybody?
I believe in Geneva they had Shelley and her husband had a lot of parties, and Lord Byron was at one of them, and I believe he challenged the group of writers to write a book in a certain amount of time. And Mary Shelley, she was so frightened by the idea of like reincarnation through the lightning that she decided to write a novel about it.
Okay, that's sort of you've got most of the cast of characters there. We had Percy Shelley, her husband, the poet Percy Shelley, and I'm not going to pronounce his middle name, it's Bish, I guess. Byron and Byron's doctor, whose name was Polidori. And we hear about the birth of Frankenstein out of that evening, but very seldom did we know that there was a vampire novel that came out of it that Polidori wrote. And I love Project Gutenberg, and if you go onto Project Gutenberg, you can read it. and I think it's being made into a movie within the coming year. So it was one of the very, very first vampire books. And you're absolutely right. She was in that room where they were challenged to write a ghost story. They were bored. And why were they bored? Because they had been doing a trip, a grand tour through Europe, and the weather changed. And so we have lots of examples of her journal writings and letters home where she talks about, oh, thank God I'm leaving London and I don't have to deal with that weather anymore. And then here we have a description. This is from her journal. When they landed after visiting the glaciers at Chamonix. Unfortunately, we do not now enjoy those brilliant skies that hailed us on our first arrival to this country. And almost perpetual rain confines us principally to the house. But when the sun bursts forth, it is with a splendor and heat unknown in England. The thunderstorms that visit us are grander and more terrific than I have ever seen before. We watch them as they approach from the opposite side of the lake, observing the lightning play among the clouds in various parts of the heavens and dart in jagged figures. So even there you get kind of a little inkling of really at once, you know, the disappointment of expecting to be at this Villa Diodati that they rented together, and being able to go out on the lake and be in boats and walk, which is so much in the romantic tradition of the time period. And it was so dark and gloomy that they couldn't even go outside. But at the same time, she looks out from the villa and beholds this incredible display of this very, very difficult weather, all of which was related to Mount Tambori. And so not only did we have these thunderstorms and these cold spells, but there were also areas of fog that colored the skies. And so we have painters like Turner, who was a little bit after her in the 1830s. Many of his paintings from that area around London, they depict a yellow sky that people think comes from the phenomena related to that eruption of that volcano. And so there are a few other things that you can look at if you go in to research that. Okay, so where are we here? Okay, I'm going to say I think that there's kind of a little misconception that I've noticed when I was doing research on Mary Shelley. She was very young. She was 18 or 19 when she wrote the book. And people will say, yeah, here was this young girl that did this phenomenal thing. And, you know, she was not formally educated. And how could she have birthed this fabulous book? But in effect, she was in a context. That's what I like to do. I like to find out what is the soil around someone that contribute to who they became. And so in her notes and her journals, and particularly in her letters, we find out a lot about her. And so the year before she went to Geneva, she had a reading list. This is about 1/3 of the books that she read in that year of 1815, and at the time she was with Shelley. And I just pulled out the ones that I think would have colored somewhat how she approached Frankenstein. And, you know, she's going to tell you that she woke up after she had this fantastic dream, which is also very romantic and very gothic, having these visions. But in reality, she was a product of a lifelong education and exposure to some of the greatest minds of the time. And so, for instance, she read Coleridge's and Wordsworth's poem, their collection, Lyrical Ballads, came out in 1798. And it was the starting point for the Romantic movement in literature. And what was one of the most important stories in there? What poem was in there by Coleridge that you probably studied in school? The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. Okay, and so she not only refers to the Ancient Mariner in Frankenstein, but she knew Coleridge. And if you think about the beginning of that masterful, and I think that's the first piece of science fiction. I don't think Frankenstein is, I think Coleridge is. He has this framing device where a wedding guest is sitting there enjoying the day, you know, minding his own business, when this strange man comes up to him and starts telling this story, which is very similar to the way Frankenstein starts. And what is the whole crux of Rime of the Ancient Mariner is we have a man who does something totally without thinking. He kills an albatross. And we're going to talk later about the law of unintended consequences. I guess his sin was not having enough respect for life that he even thought about what he was doing. Just did it. And then what we see over the period of the rest of the poem, the total maelstrom of different events that occur in the supernatural, and the whole natural world is just thrown off its edge. And then eventually he sees the light and understands the nature of his sin, and there's kind of a salvation at the end, and part of his job is to talk to people and get them aware of it. So in a way, Rime of the Ancient Mariner is a very powerful cautionary tale about the environment and the fragility of ecology and the interaction of different parts of our world. And so she was very familiar with it. Shakespeare's plays. Can you imagine sitting down? Shelley would read the plays out loud to her. And so then we have Milton's Paradise Lost, which plays also in it. Some of the other ones are Ovid's Metamorphoses, she read in Latin. Rinaldo Rinaldini was a pirate story that became very, very popular. So she wasn't just reading heavy stuff. She was reading all kinds of, every kind of popular story that was going on at the time period. And of course she was raised in a family of some of the most important and also eccentric intellectuals in England, and that was the whole context for her. If you have questions, please feel free to ask.
Actually, can I interject? I
Sure.
think it's pretty important to know that her mom was a philosopher, specifically Mary Wollstonecraft.
Yes, and she is probably one of the most significant women in the women's movement of having written the Vindication of the Rights of Women, and she also wrote Vindication of the Rights of Men. And I have a quote from her in there. And she, thank you for cueing me on that, because she died about 7 days after her daughter was born. And so we have in Mary Shelley something that's fairly common to a lot of women authors from the time period. She didn't have a mother. And even though her father remarried, she did not have the kind of nurturing relationship that would have sent her in a different direction. And she was acutely aware of that loss. Stories will tell you that one of the ways she learned to write, and this is very macabre, is she would visit her mother's grave almost every day, and she would do rubbings off the gravestone and learn how to print letters off of the letters on her mother's gravestone. So that's kind of a very creepy, very sad kind of thing to say about her. Okay, so thank you for queuing me up there. So I just wanted to cover very quickly some of the backdrop of it, because you know that it's called the New Prometheus. And the myth of Prometheus had particularly significance in the Romantic era. And of course, the short story version of Prometheus is he was a Titan, he was part God, part man, and he decided that the Romantics will say that he loved people so much that he gave them fire, which is significant in terms of a symbol of knowledge and a symbol of light, enlightenment. And he paid dearly for it for eternity by being chained to a cliff with an eagle eating away at his liver. For, how Greek mythology can you get there? Doesn't that sound great? And so he plays a particular role. And then also we have Milton's Paradise Lost, and I have to tell you, it's been so many years since I've read it, but he is referred to in Frankenstein. He's on that list. She read him in 1815 before she wrote the book. And one of the interesting things about this long epic poem of Milton is that it's about the fall of Lucifer to, hell. And he is such a powerful, charismatic figure that in some ways he overshadows all of the other characters. And so there's, again, a kind of grayness and ambiguity about his character, because he's supposed to be bringing sin to the world, and yet there's something so powerful, compelling about him that he really, kind of takes over the show of that particular piece. And then we have two more that look at the monster. And has anyone heard of the Golem? And don't think Lord of the Rings. That's not the Golem. The Golem. Anybody read about him or heard about him? I'm going to call on you again. You see, I'm just warming you up for when you give a talk.
Well, it's basically Jewish folklore and this idea of some monster that has a container.
Right, and he's crafted out of mud by a rabbi, and one of the most common tales is he's called the Golem of Prague, and the rabbi creates him to help protect the city of Prague, the Jews of Prague, because there's a pogrom, and lo and behold, if the guy just gets away from him, he gets more and more violent, and by the end, the rabbi finds a way to kill him off. He created him, and now he's going to uncreate him, but he can come back at any time. And so, there's huge amounts of literature on that. And I love this piece because this is from a 1920 German silent film called The Golem, and you can see that he's supposed to look like a mud. And the other one is Caliban from The Tempest. And is there anyone who knows anything about Caliban? Nobody? Laura, I bet Laura does. Come on, Laura.
Sure. Caliban is on the island. The Tempest takes place on an island, and the wizard Prospero, who rules over the island, when he comes there because he's sent away from Milan, there are two beings living on the island, and one is Caliban, and he's monstrous because he's the son of a witch, and he enslaves him. He ends up enslaved on the island.
Right, and he's an ugly, somewhat deformed character. This is a etching from a 1775 edition of The Tempest, and I picked him because I think he bears a resemblance to what we might consider even of the Golem. And the ironic thing I think about the play is that some of the most beautiful lines in that play come from him. And so I had one of them on the wall of my dorm room for a long time. I thought it was so beautiful. And so again, there's a certain kind of ambiguity there and a feeling that part of what makes him a monster is that the way Prospero treats him. And he's you can read all kinds of sociological and colonization is something they talk about. Prospero comes and enslaves him and essentially otherizes him, turns him into less than Prospero and his people are. And that's a theme that is part of Frankenstein as well. So those are sort of two precursors. That brings us to the book itself. And I thought it was pretty interesting because depending on when, the covers tell you something different about the book. And so on the left, we have a cover that really emphasizes Dr. Frankenstein. He's standing up there on a mountain looking at this stark landscape that he wandered into. And the two on the right both emphasize the monster, and I think the one on the top right is the most contemporary, and it's really an interesting watercolor. But the one in the middle is a version that has Prometheus on there. So if you look at it, I guess there's probably a pointer here. But there's the eagle, there's his liver showing, and there he is looking out on the world. And you wonder what he's thinking, whether he thinks it was worth it to favor humankind with knowledge that he has to pay for. This is what I'm going to call an uh-oh story. Uh-oh, you don't know what you're in for, and then you really get it kind of thing. It's a crime against nature with drastic results, which also fits right with the Ancient Mariner. He looks upon the creature that he created, Frankenstein, as much as Prometheus did. And I mentioned that one cover emphasized it. And this is a quote from a Baylor University website on British literature. In the Romantic era, Prometheus came to be regarded as a symbol for civilization and intelligence, as well as scientific knowledge. Victor himself, in his early studies, felt as though, quote, the world was to me was a secret which I desired to discover. His longing to learn the secrets of the world led him to look beyond what was natural for man to achieve. He longed to go deeper into scientific knowledge and expand the possibilities of human civilization. But like with Prometheus, going beyond the natural limits of man results in consequences. Prometheus was punished for loving his creation too well by giving him the necessities for progress. Frankenstein, on the other hand, is disgusted by his work, and his work will eventually turn on him. And I don't know if you can see it, this is blocking, but I found a quote from Mary Wollstonecraft that I thought was pretty apropos. And it says, no man chooses evil because it is evil. He only mistakes it for happiness, the good he seeks. And so, you know, here we get later about the unintentional consequences. You may have good intentions, but you also may not have any control over the result of that. And of course, what is Frankenstein's flaw, if you want to say that, in relation to his creation? Anybody? He rejects him. Why? Because he's ugly. You know, and so here he cobbled this creature together, and as soon as he sees it, he goes, oh my God, I've made a terrible mistake. And as the novel progresses, this character of the monster, and he doesn't even name him, so he's saddled with that. And by the way, Caliban was often called the monster in The Tempest. And he's rejected every turn. So this is a motherless, fatherless creature who has been abandoned, and he is trying to find his way and sort of mentally and intellectually grow into this grotesque body. And so I want to read you from the introduction to the 1831 edition. And the reason she wrote the 1831 edition was Shelley died in the 20s, and Shelley was from a very wealthy family, and his father had been essentially subsidizing their lifestyle, which was very lavish. You know, they were traveling all over the place and doing all kinds of things that are even a little hard to take today in terms of morality. Anyway, Shelley's father cut them all off. Even though he had a grandchild from Mary, he cut them completely off. And so, like any single mother, at some point, Mary Shelley had to find a way to make a living. And so she decided to authorize that a new edition be made, and she wrote the introduction to it. And this is the one right here that you'll often see. And there's also a section in there, in this particular version, with Polidori, describing the same event of that night. And so this is Mary in that introduction describing how her imagination caused her to write this book. The talk was they were reading ghost stories and, you know, getting ready to create their own. Night waned upon this talk, and even the witching hour had gone by before we retired to rest. When I placed my head on my pillow, I did not sleep, nor could I be said to think. My imagination, unbidden, possessed and guided me, gifted the successive images that arose in my mind with a vividness far beyond the usual bounds of reverie. I saw, with shut eyes, but acute mental vision, I saw the pale student of the unhallowed arts kneeling beside the thing he had put together. I saw the hideous phantasm of a man stretched out, and then, on the working of some powerful engine, show signs of life and stir with an uneasy, half-vital motion. Okay, so that's her description of the sort of the percolating mind. And of course, the language in here is very romantic in terms of having this vision and use of the word imagination image comes into her head unbidden. Coleridge, that he believed in sort of automatic writing, and he would have, of course, he was very drug induced at the time, but he woke up in the middle of a nightmare and sat down and wrote out a fragment of one of his poems from what was in his brain. And so that's a very romantic and Gothic kind of a description. I want to just hit on a couple of other things, and I want to read you some passages. One is, again, the use of the framing device, that we have this sea captain who encounters Frankenstein and recounts their getting to meet each other through letters to his sister, and it comes back at the end. We talked about Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner. It's a very common kind of approach. And then I just want to read you how Frankenstein came up with the idea that he was going to create the monster. This is during the first time that he goes to the university and meets Professor Waldman. And so he's been sitting on lectures and he's been very disappointed. There's a certain arrogance that he has to him. And he is quoting here Professor Waldman. The ancient teachers of this science promised impossibilities and performed nothing. The modern masters promise very little. They know that metal cannot be transmuted and that the elixir of life is a chimera. But these philosophers, whose hands seem only made to dabble in dirt and their eyes to pore over the microscope or crucible, have indeed performed miracles. They penetrate into the recesses of nature and show how she works in her hiding places. They ascend into the heavens. They have discovered how the blood circulates and the nature of the air we breathe. They have acquired new and almost unlimited power. They can command the thunders of heaven, mimic the earthquake, and even mock the invisible world with its own shadows. Now that's quite a description of science and the notion of the power of man through science and the language of being like a god. I mean, being Promethean is what Frankenstein is looking forward to being. And that gives you a sense of the language. Those of you who have read it, what did you find most interesting about the book? I'm curious.
I thought it was interesting how the book rarely discussed the monster. It was only, the monster only really showed up for, I'd say, a few chapters in the book where the monster kind of actually, affected Frankenstein himself, and it was mostly about Frankenstein and his, inner struggle, I guess, with knowing the fact that he abandoned a creation, how that came back to him. And it's kind of hokey, but, it's kind of like Dr. Frankenstein was the true monster in a sense.
No, I don't think that's hokey at all. In fact, I think you've hit why the book's called Frankenstein. I mean, why it's not called The Monster. And I think that what you find in that 1931 film is, to me, not having seen it for a long time, the most significant part of the film is when the little girl is playing, and he's playing with this little girl, he throws her into a pond and everything like that. And that kind of emphasis on the monster is not in the book. You're absolutely right. And I want to read what you're talking about there when the monster confronts him. And this is what he says. He talks directly to Frankenstein. Remember that I am thy creature. I ought to be thy Adam, but I am rather the fallen angel. There's a reference right there to Paradise Lost. Whom thou drivest from joy for no misdeed. Everywhere I see bliss, from which I alone am irrevocably excluded. I was benevolent and good. Misery made me a fiend. Make me happy, and I shall again be virtuous. And how does Frankenstein respond? Get away from me. Be gone. And he says, the monster continues, how can I move thee? Will no entreaties cause thee to turn a favorable eye upon thy creature? who implores thy goodness and compassion? Believe me, Frankenstein, I was benevolent. My soul glowed with love and humanity. But am I not alone, miserably alone? How sad can that be? You know, and I think there's some little irony there, because how does Walton, the captain, see Victor Frankenstein? How does he describe him? One of the most benevolent, kind people he'd ever met. You know, and so to have the mirror on him from a different direction and see how he has the capacity to totally close off compassion for his creation, I think that's one of the most powerful scenes in the book. And of course we have biblical references there. He said, I could have been your Adam. I could have been the beginning of this brave new world of special creatures, you know, and you turned me aside. You made me the other. Okay, so I have one more reading I'm going to give you from the time period. Do you know what the responses to Frankenstein when it came out were? Of course, in 1818 it came out anonymously, and there were a lot of people trying to guess who did it. And did anybody know what the response was to her, to the novel? Okay, well, I guess I'll just have to read it. Okay, this is, I think this one's kind of interesting. It's from Edinburgh Magazine, March 1818. It's a very, very long article. But essentially, and it does talk about Caliban. And the author of the article really takes exception to the science fiction part of it, the creation of a world that could not be. And so he talks about the consequences of the wild and irregular theories of the age. And so talking about the rise of the Romantic movement. And then later on he said, getting over this original absurdity, that is the creation of the monster, the character of our monster is in good keeping. There is a grandeur, too, in the scenery in which he makes his appearances, the ice mountains of the pole or the glaciers of the Alps, his natural tendency to kind feelings, and the manner in which they were blighted, and all the domestic picture of the cottage are very interesting and beautiful. We hope yet to have more productions, both from this author and his great model, Mr. Godwin, but they would make a great improvement in their writings if they would rather study the established order of nature as it appears, both in the world of matter and of mind, than continue to revolt our feelings by hazardous innovations in either of these departments. And so what is he doing? He's saying, how dare you come up with something new and different? And of course, you know, most people will say this is the first science fiction book. And so always it seems that in the early readings of the critics that they enjoyed the language. They thought there was poetry in there and the descriptions of this icy landscape and everything that permeates the book. And yet the whole notion behind it is just anathema to them. And of course, you could view it from a religious lens of being anti-religious, you know, taking creation out of the hands of God, which is, you know, a common theme there. So those are some passages that I think help. Okay. One last thing. One of her last letters that she wrote on that trip, she made a reference to a man called Conte Buffon, who was a naturalist from earlier time period. He was a Frenchman born in 1797, and 1788 he wrote a book. And she's referring to his book because he had a theory that the world was going into an ice age. And she said, I will not pursue Buffon's sublime but gloomy theory that this globe, which we inhabit, will at some future period be changed into a mass of frost by the encroachment of the polar ice. and of that produced on the most elevated points of the earth. So clearly she was interested in natural history. It was the beginning of climate, people actually looking into weather and researching it, and she was completely intrigued by that. So, you know, really her genius was in an incredibly diverse curiosity that came out of the life that she'd had with the parents and the home she had. Okay, so I don't even think you can see this, but there's an interesting website on The Guardian, which is, you know, an English newspaper, had a whole series of charts, and it was called Mary Shelley's Frankenstein in Charts. Because one of the other theories, you know, every good piece of literature, you can take it from multiple directions. And so one of the other theories is that the morbidity and the notion of the abandoned child and the fact that the monster has no mother comes from her own history of death after death after death. And so I can see, for instance, in 1818, her daughter died at the age of 1, so this is during the time period of her writing it. In 1816, her half-sister, Fanny Imlay, killed herself with a laudanum overdose, and even her mother had tried to commit suicide by drowning at one point. And so clearly, in modern standards, we might look at this and think, there's a family that has a history of even clinical depression, that there's something going on within those family. And then in June 1819, her son died of malaria. And so all of this time, and then of course Percy died very young. He drowned at the age of 29. And so this is another one of those theories that they apply to it, that the whole dark tone and her preoccupation with the abandonment of the monster and what it does to turn him from something with the potential for great good and for almost an idealistic notion of this future race of man-like creatures came from all of these experiences that she had in a very short period of time with death. If you go to the website, it's pretty fun to watch because it sort of puts everything into about 8 different slides that look at one time her book was outselling Percy's poetry by 7 to 1. And so, of course, at that time they didn't know that she was married to him. But I wonder, you know, with an ego such as his, how he felt about something like that. I'm not sure how enlightened he was. And then we finally look at what next. And do we have anybody watch Humans on BBC? No? It's about robots, very human-like robots that become sentient, and a war ensues with the people around London over these sentient beings who are supposed to be taking care of the world, and they turn on them because they begin to realize that they have a capacity to think and have emotions. But these are 3 of my favorites. Karl Kapek's R.U.R. is the 1921 play where we got the term robot from. And his characters, they run amok. You know, there's a lot of running amok of humanoid and combination human mechanical beings, and his robots are supposed to be there taking care of the world, and they run amok and start killing people. Then Fritz Lang's Metropolis, which is probably my favorite movie of all time. Has anybody seen it? Okay, tell us a little bit about Metropolis, why it's appropriate to talk about that today.
Well, it's a 1927 film, and it's kind of about a futuristic society, and it kind of deals with like a robot's role in that society, essentially.
Yeah, and it's very, very fraught with polarities. You have the upper world, everything is light, and all these kind of Aryan guys are running around in shorts and doing athletic things. And then you have this underbelly of the poor people who lead a very mechanistic life. They go to work by the clock. They're the cogs in the wheel that runs this society. And one of the characters in it, he creates there's a good Maria and there's a bad Maria, and he builds a mechanical robot and zaps it with electricity, and before your very eyes, in very primitive filmatic technology, she becomes simulacrum of Maria, and she becomes the bad Maria. And very much, I think that was influenced by Frankenstein. And of course, we have the Bride of Frankenstein and some of the others. And then we have lots of examples going all the way through. But again, what is the common theme is that these are fiddling with nature causes, these creatures don't have the soul or the capacity intellectually, and so they run amok. That's the uh-oh part of this kind of technology. And then Westworld, has anybody seen that? Okay, we'll let you talk. Oh, we should let James. James can't talk. Okay. What do you...
Well, Westworld is based upon the Michael Crichton film earlier, essentially of having an amusement type park in which there are automaton, and they're supposed to allow for the guests to basically lead out whatever deviant desires they happen to possess, and these automaton have the capacity later on to become sentient in a way that allows for them to become aware of how they've been treated, and then you have them running amok.
Right. And of course, the original movie becomes this HBO series that I think drawing it out so much, I got a little, toward the end, a little tired of it. But the technology, the ability in film to do what we do today, it's very, very sophisticated. And so the making of these automatons, and it's the same theme, they just have the capacity start memory. They start remembering things because their memories are wiped, their artificial memories are wiped, and suddenly they begin bleeding through, and as soon as that start happens, they begin to question their environment and who they are. And those are some of the masks that become the faces of these automatons. It's kind of an interesting dark side of Walt Disney's It's a Small, Small World. All those little faces, smiling faces, those little automatons that you go through at Disney World. And it's very creepy because sometimes you don't know who's real and who's not, and I think that's an important. And of course, Michael Crichton, as far as I'm concerned, if you look at many of his novels, they have that kind of component to them, whether in medicine, Andromeda Strain, where these people come back from exploring the universe and they introduce a virus that nobody understands and they have to figure out. It's kind of a mystery story. And of course, Jurassic Park. Okay, so on that I want to...
You got to talk about that last quote.
I thought this was fascinating. There's a new documentary, a brand new documentary out called Do You Trust This Computer? And what an interesting question. And this is from Elon Musk, says artificial intelligence doesn't have to be evil to destroy humanity. If AI has a goal and humanity just happens to be in the way, it will destroy humanity as a matter of course without even thinking about it, no hard feelings. And actually that fits the Golem. It fits to some degree the Frankenstein's monster, and it sure fits what we're seeing happening today. This is a really relevant quote. And so when we're thinking about why we're still reading and talking about Frankenstein 200 years later, it's because it is so relevant to the issues we're tackling today. Is there only one of you from the Technology and Human Values class? What are some of the issues that you're talking about in that class right now?
How technology is changing the way we view our stuff, how it involves in such things as sports, how people are watching more movies than reading books, and all kind of that same course, and how people are just using technology now instead of using the old-fashioned way. Particularly
of communication, right. And one of the reasons that course was designed and courses like it had to do with our knowledge that technology was moving much faster than our capacity as human beings to predict what the end piece would be. And so that's where this idea of the law of unintended consequences. So there are three directions that go. One is that you can have an unexpected positive benefit. And I will say that there's Mary Shelley. I don't think she had an intended consequence of her book being celebrated 200 years later. And yet there was something so compelling in what she was writing and so applicable to the ethics of science and the nature of what makes us human that that was a positive outcome that was not predicted. The other one, the next one, is where you get both. Okay, and I'm thinking particularly because we're so looking at the climate control document that just document that just came out, and some of the issues related to sustainable energy. And I was thinking about like solar energy as an alternative form. How does that have both negative and positive consequences?
Are you talking cost?
Well, you could be talking cost. In what way?
And that only a higher economic class of people can afford solar panels because of the initial cost of the item? That's what I'm thinking.
Okay, what else? What's a negative impact of solar energy? And we're talking about, obviously, it comes from the perspective of individual peoples. What about the loss of the industries that solar is replacing? And so we have coal miners, we have different groups of people who for generations made their living on a technology that has become obsolete. And so how do they view the encroachment of solar energy? They're going to look at it in a very different way. Okay, and then the final one is the perverse result, sometimes called the backfire. And that's what we're looking at with Frankenstein and a lot of these apocalyptic novels that are coming around. Mary Shelley actually wrote another book called The Last Man, and it's about the consequences of a plague-like event that occurs, and there's this guy that's the last man left on earth. She really enjoyed uplifting, bright stories to tell. Any other examples you can think of that are really, really current right now? That we're looking at sort of technologies where we didn't anticipate what the unintended consequences would be?
It's interesting that I was thinking about the environmental movement and the people that oppose it and the corporations and stuff that will lose their ability to produce our propositions in Arizona for energy. And there was an article in the paper about who finances the ABS and who finances the other side, and the fact that the country has divided and people have come to actually hate each other. I thinking that Elon Musk quote that was in there about artificial intelligence. He was defining psychopathology or antisocial personality disorder, where people have an inability to empathize with another, so when they have a goal, it doesn't matter to them what happens to the other. If they have to go through them, they'll go through them. And he says the computer might do that.
I think that's probably what that documentary is about. Yeah, I would like to see that. I have like 1 minute left, right? How's that? I won't dwell on this, but there's still innately all of these different cultural ripples that come out of this book, and she herself was somewhat a product of cultural ripples that came out of Jewish folklore, Greek tradition, Greek myths, and Shakespeare, and all of that context. And so then we have even Jenny's favorite movie, Frankenweenie, Tim Burton, And of course, Herman Munster up at the top. And so even today, we recognize that the face, the image has become iconic, that we recognize it no matter where we are. And I just want to end with, I have a handout for you, but there's a lot going on, and these two events that are coming up are really, really special. And I have heard Deirdre Mary Rogers sing. She's kind of a Celtic person, and she will play Mary Shelley. I don't play Mary Shelley, but she will make it a lot of fun, and she encourages people to come in costume, and that's is that next Tuesday or a week from Tuesday? Week from Tuesday. And the other one I am just dying to see is November 15th. If you haven't taken advantage of the National Theater Live series here at Yavapai College, what have you missed? And this is the 2011 production of the Frankenstein, which was done by Danny Boyle, and Benedict Cumberbatch and Johnny Lee Miller alternate the roles. And so one day one is Frankenstein and the other one is. And I have a friend that's seen it, and she said the most masterful part of the play is we actually watch the awakening of the monster in this adult body as he writhes on the floor and kind of stretches and like a newborn might, and becomes increasingly aware of his environment and begins to have his inside catch up with this outside human body. And it's supposed to be really quite a program, and you can't watch it on YouTube. You can't get it on anywhere. You can't rent it because it doesn't exist. And on that note, thanks for coming.